Good evening. I'm Charles Pink, president of the OSS Society, and on its behalf, I'm pleased to welcome you to the first installment in our 2023 OSO Social Conversation Series. The name for this series was inspired by a column written by Drew Pearson, the leading Washington columnist of his day. He wrote a column that was critical of General Donovan and the OSS. He said that so many OSS personnel were members of the Social Register, its initials really stood for OSO Social. And Pearson owned a farm located not far from Congressional Country Club in Bethesda, Maryland, which served as an OSS training facility during World War II. After Pearson's column was published, General Donovan sent a group of OSS commandos who were training at Congressional to raid his farm, but just for practice. We're honored to bring you leaders from the intelligence and special operations communities to discuss critical national security issues. Tonight, we're very honored to have former Secretary of Defense, the Honorable Jim Mattis, with us for a discussion with our chairman, Dr. Mike Vickers, the former Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. And Dr. Vickers' memoir is about to be published. You can see its title there on the screen. And the OSS Society is honored to host this preview of Dr. Vickers' forthcoming book, by all means available, Memoirs of a Life in Intelligence, Special Operations, and Strategy. We've made a link to purchase the book available in the chat function on your screen. Feel free to submit questions using the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and please include your affiliation when you do. And I'd now like to thank our series sponsors, BCG Federal, Incatel, FedEx, and General Atomics, and our series patrons whose names are listed on your screen. And to the hundreds of people who are with us this evening, I want to thank all of you for supporting the OSS Society and our charity's vital work. Today happens to be the OSS's birthday. It was founded on this date in 1942 by President Roosevelt when he signed a military order and appointed General Donovan as its director. And I can't think of two distinguished people to help us commemorate this event than Jim Mattis and Mike Vickers. Now it's my honor to welcome General Mattis, who will be our moderator this evening. Secretary Mattis was raised in Southeastern Washington and graduated from Central Washington State College. He served for over 40 years in the Marine Corps as an infantry officer, in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, as NATO's Supreme Allied Commander, and as the commander of U.S. Central Command, comprised of 250,000 U.S. and Allied troops in combat across the Middle East and South Asia. Subsequently, he served as a 26th Secretary of Defense from January 2017 to December 2018. In 2019, Secretary Mattis received the William J. Donovan Award from the OSS Society. And this award recognizes an individual who has rendered distinguished service to the United States of America and demonstrates the exceptional characteristics and achievements of General Donovan. In 2019, his memoir, Call Sign Chaos, Learning to Lead, was published by Random House. For nearly half a century, Secretary Mattis was always where America needed him most, from battalion, brigade, and division commander in combat to our commander in the Middle East, and then our Secretary of Defense. His leadership is the stuff of legend. His mastery of operational art unsurpassed. He won his battles and campaigns and stands at the summit of the greatest military leaders our nation has produced over the past several decades. As Secretary of Defense, his steadfast leadership and strategic competence reassured Americans and allies alike as he began redesigning our military and defense establishment for the challenges of the great power competition. Like General Donovan, he knows the vital contribution our allies make to American security. And also like General Donovan, he understands the critical importance of intelligence and special operations as our nation's first line of defense. Now, before I hand the program over to General Mattis, I'd like to remind everyone that we will have a Q&A session at the end of the discussion. If you'd like to ask any questions of Dr. Vickers, please enter them and your affiliation in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. And General Mattis, it's my honor to hand this over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Charles, for that very generous introduction. It's my honor to be here with you this evening, ladies and gentlemen, and facilitate this conversation with a dear friend, a former colleague, and the chairman of our OSS Society, Dr. Michael Vickers. We all mostly know him or have worked with him or for him. But his career as a special operator, a CIA operations officer, a national security policymaker, an intelligence community leader has spanned the last 2 decades of the Cold War, and then through a decade and a half of our war with Al-Qaeda its allies, and its offshoots, and that service saw unprecedented senior tenure across Republican and Democrat administrations. Even in an increasingly partisan era, Mike was the good soldier, the nonpartisan patriot who was trusted by all. Most recently, Dr. Vickers serves as the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, exercising authority and direction and control over the National Security Agency, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, the National Reconnaissance Office, the Defense Security Service, and the intelligence components of the military services and their combatant commands. He has received the nation's highest awards in the field of intelligence and defense, including the Presidential National Security Medal. He holds a PhD from Johns Hopkins, an MBA from the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania, and a bachelor's degree from the University of Alabama. He currently serves as an executive vice president at In-Q-Tel, a principal at the Telemus Group, a senior advisor to the Boston Consulting Group, a senior fellow at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and on several corporate, nonprofit, and government boards. Tonight, we are here to discuss his forthcoming memoir, By All Means Available. It's a memoir of a life in intelligence, special operations, and strategy. And I would just tell you that I've read it, and it is a great book, the most revealing book you could imagine. So Mike, please we welcome you, truly what I would call a man for all seasons. It's an honor to have you here with us this evening. Let us begin.
Jim, it's a great pleasure to be with you.
It's good to see you again, Michael, even at a distance. But ladies and gentlemen, I mentioned this is a great book, and I mean that. I've had the opportunity to read it in advance. And if for anyone who wants to understand not just the issues, but the tenor of those times, this is the most penetrating and probably the single most comprehensive book I've read. It takes you inside the room or inside the operations. But Mike, writing a book is a lot of work. I mean, you're a slave to it for month after month. It hangs over you. You never want to take any time off because the book is waiting for your attention. So why did you write this? What was your intent? What was your mission here?
Well, I had three reasons, really three duties I felt I had. One was to history, since I had participated in three major historical events: our covert effort to drive the Soviets out of Afghanistan in the 1980s, our campaigns in the last decade and a half to dismantle and bring to operational defeat core al-Qaeda and some of its allies, and then the operation that brought justice to Osama bin Laden. I also felt a responsibility to my fellow citizens to explain what I could based on declassified information that has recently become available. Not just the what, but the how and why of secret operations that have shaped the world we live in today over the past 4 decades of my service. And the third and probably most important reason was I felt a duty to our future intelligence professionals, special operators, and strategists to pass on what I've learned. I'm worried about the challenges we face going forward, domestically and internationally. And I want our side to win. The world will be a better place if we do. And so I wanted to do my part in passing on what I had learned.
Well, Mike, for those who don't know you well, I'd like to put a little bit more of a human face on you here. Where do you get the values that bred you? We're talking about putting together a museum to kind of try to stimulate more people to want to serve in these lines of work, these perilous lines of work. What values made you want to be a Green Beret and then an operations officer in the CIA? And more importantly, to stick with it year after year. It's not like this isn't frustrating work at times, maddeningly complex. Where did the values come from that bred a soldier like you?
Well, like most people, I think from my parents. My father was a B-17 bombardier and gunner with the 8th Air Force in World War II, doing bombing missions over Germany, before D-Day, and won a Silver Star. And I very much admired what he did in World War II. When I was 8 years old, I had an Air Force birthday party. Didn't end up being an Air Force or an airman or an Air Force officer, but that was one thing. And then my mother worked her way up from the graveyard shift to hospital administrator, and always found time to get me to wherever I needed to go for sports and everything. But in terms of specifically wanting to be a Green Beret and CIA officer, my senior year in high school, I had a international relations teacher named Dr. Anthony DeRigi, and we were sitting in the school library, and he put a copy of the New York Times, that day's New York Times, in front of me, and there was an article about CIA's big paramilitary operation in Laos during the Vietnam War and about a secret base at a place called Long Cheng. And he said, "You might be interested in this." And I don't know why he said that. I was just a jock at the time, but I started thinking about it, and I thought, yeah, secret armies, that sounds pretty cool. I think I'd like to be involved with secret armies. And so then I would say, when I made a decision to want to go into that field about a year and a half later, after trying one last hand at sports and at a community college, the Green Berets represented to me the best path into the CIA, an elite part of our military. And I wanted to go into both them and the CIA because I felt that was an area where you would get the toughest missions, but where individuals might really make a difference. And so, maybe I saw too many James Bond movies as a kid, but that's what got me into that line of work. And then staying with it, I was just blessed that each time I thought, well, maybe I would do something else, I found I had more challenges and was learning more at each stage. And so I just stuck with it. And what I loved when I was in my 20s and 30s as an operator, I loved just as much when I was in my late 40s and 50s as a policymaker.
Yeah, I think when you look at where your values came from, you and I had the good fortune to be raised by the greatest generation. I think we were the luckiest generation, frankly, because of it. But you did prove that individuals do make a difference. And that difference became most immediately apparent when you go into the CIA, and almost immediately you're engaged in the Grenada operation. And then in 1984, you are selected to be the CIA's Afghanistan Covert Action Program Officer. And, you said that job was the job of a lifetime. A lot of people might look at that job and say, that's pretty intimidating, or that's pretty demanding. It's not really what I, anticipated. And here you are, just brand new, and there you're thrust into it. Why was it the job of a lifetime to you? You kind of alluded to it when you talked about the lure of going in, but now you're in, and that it's always different when you're now on the chopping block.
Yeah, so the reason is we had covert actions going on in Central America and Afghanistan, and soon other areas of the world. But I saw Afghanistan as the main fight. I had trained as a special forces soldier to go behind enemy lines in the event of a war in World War III in Europe, including with a backpack nuclear weapon, and to stir up resistance. And so I, as a young special forces soldier, I dreamt of the opportunity to liberate Eastern Europe and do great deeds. And I even thought that, well, if the Soviets invaded China, which, tensions were getting bigger with them, that I might help the Chinese as we did in World War II against the Japanese. Little did I know that later in my career, Eastern Europe would get liberated partially by the Soviet defeat in Afghanistan, and the Chinese would be big allies of ours in Afghanistan, and that Afghanistan would be my fight. But there it was. And I had trained for this, for a better part of a decade, and had operational experience in Grenada. But it was really the attraction of taking on our main enemy directly through covert action, what had already become the largest covert action in CIA's history. Its budget had just been quadrupled. And I thought, this is really the opportunity of a lifetime, that I was just thrilled to be selected.
Well, you've always been a lifelong learner. You've been curious about everything under the sun, Mike, and it was a rough school that you were thrust into, and you led that effort in our secret war in Afghanistan for years. It wasn't like you went in for a 6-month tour, something like that. And it was our largest and most successful covert action program, probably in the agency's history, resulting in the Soviet Army's biggest, and I think their first and only defeat in the field. And it also turned in, like you said, to a major contributor to us winning the Cold War and the freedom of Eastern Europe, as you just mentioned. Now, let me jump you forward. And how do you apply the lessons that you learned during those years to the challenging environment we face today? And what can we take from your experience and apply, say, to Ukraine or other proxy wars?
Yeah, so Ukraine is more obviously an overt war and higher intensity artillery battles, and now wars of movement with armored forces. But a lot of the principles are the same, and that is, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan with too small of a force to effectively occupy the whole country. They made the same mistake in Ukraine. They suffer from morale problems as they did in Afghanistan, compared to the extraordinary morale of the Ukrainians fighting them, just like the Afghans. And so the challenge for us is to really build up Ukrainian forces to where they can achieve tactical dominance in certain areas. And I hope we have done that sufficiently for this counteroffensive, which seems to be underway. But it's really the thing you learn from our largest and most successful covert actions is the importance of scale, scope in some cases, a mix of capabilities, training, intelligence, and not just weapons and ammunition, but also speed, so you can get ahead of the enemy and present them with dilemmas that they can't counter. In the 1980s, both we and the Soviets surged at the same time in 1985, and we won the Battle of Surges. We escalated more sharply than they did. We went, for example, from 20-some surface-to-air missiles in the hands of the Afghan resistance to almost 2,000 within 12 months, made Soviet aviators' life miserable.
Yeah, so looking at that experience, though, Mike, how do you address the Allies part of it? Kind of throwing you a curveball here, because the Allies, the special forces, especially CIA as well, really focuses a lot on Allies, and applying the lessons about the Allies that you learned. How does that impact your thinking about today?
Oh, it's great. America's way of war depends on allies, and it's a big source of advantage for us. Different allies for different purposes, a global counterterrorism network against Al-Qaeda, NATO and other alliances in the Cold War against the threat of a Soviet invasion. But in our secret war, for example, we had a secret alliance with China, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the United Kingdom, and several other countries. And it was really this global secret coalition that enabled us to do what we did. We couldn't have done it without them. Saudis matched us dollar for dollar in funding for our program, essentially doubling the size of whatever budget I had at the time. The Chinese were our biggest arms supplier, followed by the Egyptians. The Brits provided critical intelligence and some sophisticated weapons, paving the way for the introduction of US weapons. And so those allies were absolutely critical. And it's the same with Ukraine today. Some European nations are doing more than others, but they're all in it to one degree or another. And I think you've said before, Europe and NATO have never been as unified as they are now, and in fact are expanding. Putin's getting exactly the opposite of what he intended.
Yeah, we remember history's altruism, that nations with allies thrive and nations without allies wither. We're watching Russia wither before our eyes right now. So you go from being an operator, from directing operations, you leave government service. You're moving on at this point. And after 9/11, no surprise there, you came back into the government. And this time as an assistant secretary of defense for special operations, low intensity, et cetera, and that's where you and I actually worked closely together for a period of time there. How did your prior service as an operator color your judgment when you come in now to provide the civilian oversight, the policy oversight of the troops who are now going in harm's way and carrying out the policy, the strategy, and the direction that's being given them?
Yeah, so having a lot of years as a special operator and CIA operations officer, doing a range of operations from counterterrorism to unconventional warfare or paramilitary covert action, as we say in CIA, really prepared me well for the war that we found ourselves in after 9/11, that was mostly irregular warfare and had a big counterterrorism dimension, had to adapt to new capabilities, but that operational experience, I think, served me well. A second thing was the relationships I had built from before that carried over. Bob Gates was a senior CIA officer when I was doing the Afghanistan Covert Action Program. I knew people like Eric Olson and Bill McRaven from my earlier days. And so forging common strategy with that group and people like you and Stan McChrystal was easy, because we'd all grown up in that same generation and had similar experiences. And then while I was getting my PhD, I co-founded a think tank and worked on transformation for a rising China challenge for the late Andy Marshall, and got steeped in future warfare and precision weapons, long-range strike, undersea capabilities. And so when I had responsibility for defense transformation and our strategic forces as an assistant secretary, they called it SOLIC plus interdependent capabilities, and you were at Joint Forces Command for a part of that time as a close partner. But that had prepared me well too, and all those things kind of came together in that job.
Well, you bring up the point about relations, and there's a saying in the military that relations between commanders are more important than where you sit on an organization chart. And you really brought that home, the way you could create trust across various organizations that don't naturally work well together in some cases. And obviously, as Churchill put it, fighting alongside allies is the hardest thing in the world, except fighting without allies. Yep. And that's really, that's even worse. And shifting over a bit to strategy, though, you are now definitely in the strategic realm. And you had not dealt with that when you were an operator. Sometimes you actually worked some of that freedom of not having a strict strategy and used your operation to help craft it as we were kind of making it up as we went along. But in your book, you wrote a lot about the challenges of crafting strategy. It comes out on many of the pages in there as you became more senior. And here President Bush tasked you actually with writing the strategy in partnership with CIA to disrupt and dismantle Al-Qaeda in the border region there between Pakistan and Afghanistan. What did you put into that strategy? I know you had some background, but you had to look at this more broadly now and look at more than just the role of the individual operators. What did you put in that strategy, and how successful was it?
Yes. So first, a bit of history. One of the key principles we learned after 9/11 from our pre-9/11 experience, unfortunate experience, and the attacks of 9/11 is the imperative of denying these global jihadist groups any sanctuary. And so while we denied them the sanctuary that they had in Afghanistan in 2001, they were able to reconstitute, as were the Taliban, in Pakistan after suffering, major losses thanks to the operations led by you and others. And by 2005, the terrorist threat had grown pretty significantly in the Afghanistan-Pakistan border region. 2006, we had the transatlantic airliner plot to blow up 10 airliners over the Atlantic Ocean that would have resulted in comparable deaths, maybe a bit more than 9/11. And by 2007, President Bush had realized that our strategy of essentially relying on the Pakistanis and doing limited drone strikes in the region with Pakistani concurrence wasn't working. And the insurgency was also getting worse in Afghanistan, as you know. So in 2007, he asked me and a small group at CIA and a few people from Central Command, your command, and Special Operations Command to start developing a strategy. And what we came up with was far more intense predator strikes that required policy changes, expansions of the target lists, different kinds of authorities for strikes, and a lot more scale, a lot more aircraft and crews, special operations raids, to efforts to work with Pakistani special forces and conventional forces to deny territory, and a couple of still classified lines of operations I can't talk about here. So that plus some development assistance by the State Department, we put together a comprehensive strategy to deny Al-Qaeda its safe haven and its safe haven providers. That was another important point of the strategy, not just go after Al-Qaeda, not just to go after its leaders, but take apart the whole organization, dismantle that organization, and dismantle, take away the safe haven providers who were enabling it to live in that sanctuary. So Haqqanis became targets, and Pakistan Taliban, a group called the Commander Nazir Group. And just as we were developing the strategy, President Musharraf of Pakistan got into political trouble and eventually was forced from office, but it created a bit of a hiatus. And then as soon as that looked like it was going to be resolved, President Bush approved the strategy in August 2008, and we commenced it and sustained it across the Obama administration, and it produced very good results. And I was fortunate enough to be the one to brief President Bush on the overall strategy that August day with Mike Hayden and Steve Hadley, and then same for our congressional leadership a bit later.
Yeah, and I would just point out, Mike, that we can't ignore the fact you gave 100% over many years. I got to ask you, how do you think Afghanistan turned out? I mean, how would you characterize this?
Oh, it's heartbreaking, given the role they played in helping us win the Cold War, and then the role Afghanistan played in our war with Al-Qaeda. And I also think it was, like Ryan Crocker and others have said, a major strategic blunder to have given up what we had won at great cost. And we essentially turned a stalemate where we held most of the cards into a defeat where the Taliban only won because we gave up, not because they were destined to win. And it has consequences, not just for Afghanistan, but for global jihadism. They think if they just wait long enough, they'll eventually win. But also for our relations with China and Russia, who looked at this and saw American weakness. So I think it was an unfortunate major blunder that unfortunately we had bipartisan support for, but it was not the right move.
Yeah, it wasn't. And in these very partisan times, Mike, you have been able to maintain a nonpartisan level of trust across those two parties. I've got a question here from Lieutenant Colonel Bangvall. U.S. politics, he says, has over the past half decade become very partisan. I think we saw it the start of this much further back. It seems so very far apart between those two parties, almost unable to manage the country's affairs. Should America's allies be concerned that the U.S. defense intelligence community can instill confidence in their abilities with allies? In other words, the backdrop of politics, is that overshadowing the role of our folks in the intelligence community? to have confidence in us?
Well, when you find yourself in a competition like we are now with strategic competition, like we are now with China and Russia, like the Soviet-American Cold War, some degree of consistency and grand strategy is really critical. We had that with containment. Sometimes we had more aggressive containment, sometimes not, some symmetric, some asymmetric. But at least through 1968, we had a pretty broad bipartisan consensus. And then enough to sustain it through the winning of the Cold War. I worry about our domestic cohesion and unity and our national will now more than I worry about any international problem. And while we're a powerful country with security relationships around the world, our allies do look inside the United States and wonder if they can count on us either for consistency or that we'll take wild swings, or that we're really retreating from the world, which has been another trend kind of over the past decade that I certainly hope we reverse.
Well, let's drill it down just one more level now. After the shambolic withdrawal from Afghanistan, within a few months, the CIA is briefing our NATO allies and others that Putin is going to invade. Obviously, we were reading their mail pretty well. Give us your assessment of the American administration's use of intelligence in the lead up to Putin's invasion and since he's invaded. Well, tactically, strategically, how do you evaluate, how do you grade the administration's use of intelligence in building this alliance?
Yeah, so I think it's done very well. I think there were some hopes that maybe this dominant intelligence advantage that we have might be a deterrent to war. I think that was unrealistic. But I think, just as you said, its use in fortifying a coalition to resist Russian aggression was critical. And then the intelligence support, just from what I know from reading the open press, to the Ukrainians seems to have enabled their operations, and they seem to be quite clever at generating intelligence as well. There have been private companies that have helped them fuse intelligence together, which I think has also played a role. But in an indirect conflict like this, material support, but also non-material support in training and advice and intelligence plays a pretty critical role. And so I give them pretty high marks in that regard. Higher marks in intelligence and more lately in training than I think in materiel support. I think we've held back a bit too much, have been a little slow and not as comprehensive as we might be in giving the Ukrainians the capabilities they need to win. But in intelligence, we've done a good job.
Yeah, there's another question that we have coming in here, Mike, a very interesting one. Looking back over your career, what is one piece of advice that you would pass on to your 30-year-old self as you were rising through the ranks of your respective services organizations? What sticks with you that you kind of wish you'd been using as an operant principle that you learned later in life?
So one, I think it's really seek out the tough jobs. I was fortunate and had people who had confidence in me from the time I was in my late 20s to mid 30s to be given greater and greater responsibilities in the operational realm. And some of them seemed like jobs that were so tough, others didn't want them because they didn't think we could win. Afghanistan was one of those. And so I think, taking those kinds of risks and being bold when you're given the opportunity is important. And then later in my career, like a lot of us, we get really good at one thing and then we broaden. We learn more about our respective service or whatever the case may be. And then we learn more about the joint force and the interagency and how we can bring all elements of national power together. And that in-depth expertise and then broadening at the appropriate time helped me later in my career when I had much broader responsibilities as an assistant secretary and then undersecretary. And then I don't know that this is good advice for everybody, but most of the jobs I had, I really loved. And some jobs I declined jobs that I didn't think were a great fit for me, where I could really make a difference. That's not for everybody, but it worked for me.
Yeah, the question was asked for me to also respond to this, and just listening to you, I looking back myself, I think I wish I would have learned better how to give clearer intent so I could align large organizations and give less direction, delegate the decision-making lower and lower and lower so that we could move more agilely and more fluidly against the enemy. We do pretty good at that compared to other forces. I just think that there's always more initiative and aggressiveness down below if you can find a way to unleash it.
Yeah, and that's the challenge of high command. The higher up you go, the more important that becomes.
It certainly is. There's a question here, Mike, about again about the how we're using intelligence and whether or not we're really giving it to the allies in a way that bonds them to us. And what the old problem is: sources and methods. We don't want to reveal that. I often found you could do a lot of revealing intelligence, and they weren't even interested in the sources and methods. So I kind of got. Matter of fact, I made coffee cups at CENTCOM and that said, replaced no foreign with yes foreign. We're going to figure a way to share the intelligence. It just seemed to bring the manhood out in many of these guys who might be otherwise timid, because if we could tell them what they really faced, they were no longer fearful of the dark, so to speak. And especially going back to the earlier question, if we could be seen as a reliable ally, we wouldn't leave them hanging.
Yeah,
which is always a challenge. But
yeah,
how are we doing actually releasing this and building our allies through the use of intelligence? We're doing it well maybe on this one crisis right now, but how are we doing more broadly?
Yeah, I think generally okay. You raise an important point that, intelligence hopefully informs our policymakers to where they can make wise policy, and then enables our operations to where we can conduct more effective operations. But given that allies are so important to American strategy and the American way of war, it's useful in terms of building our power in that dimension. We wouldn't have a global counterterrorism network is only as good as the intelligence you're sharing with them, so they can arrest terrorists and disrupt plots. And so you're using their capacity by enabling it with intelligence. And there are lots of other cases like that. And yes, you have to protect sources and methods. And sometimes the most sensitive intelligence is too identifiable with an individual agent, perhaps, or a technical collection access or something. But those are the rarer cases. There's plenty of intelligence where, just as you said, you can talk about what we know, but not how we know it, and that suffices, plenty.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is an area too where your book is very revealing about how it was used in various cases. And for me, it gave almost a template of thinking, how do you decide what to share and where is it going to benefit you? There's another question come in. In Ukraine, how is it going to impact us in the Indo-Pacific? The outcome in Ukraine is going to have a global impact. How will that manifest, you think, in the Indo-Pacific? And obviously, we're looking directly into Beijing. How will it impact Beijing? So success by the Ukrainians or a defeat of the Ukrainians? How does this impact us more broadly?
Well, I think it matters enormously that the Ukrainians win, the Russians are defeated. And it matters for Ukraine, obviously, for the United States. It matters for Russia. A weakened Russia certainly weakens China and its alliance with Russia. It poses less of a threat to Europe, but it has indirect effects too. If Russia were to win, if you take the counter side, then Europe would feel more threatened and accommodative. China would be emboldened. And then the subtler competitions of the new Cold War, the economic advantage we want to accrue for us and our allies against China could become more porous as Europeans decide and Asian states to balance more between the United States and China. So there are global ramifications to this European conflict, as well as major European conflict or implications. And then, in terms of deterring China, the more Russia struggles, the more hopefully it gives them pause and it introduces uncertainty into what response they might get if they invade someone in Asia, particularly Taiwan. And so there are implications directly in the Indo-Pacific, as well as for our allies globally and our prospects for winning the new Cold War.
Right, and that's what we've got to be alert to. The intelligence community is really our sentinel for the country, always scanning the horizon, always looking for what threat is coming. And we've got a question from the audience here about what are the future challenges you see coming, say in about 5 to 10 years. And I might even limit that to about 5 or 7 years, because it's at the speed of change in the world today. I'd be hesitant to go much further out than that. But what do you see coming in the next 5 to 7 years, say, in terms of a threat that we're not anticipating right now? Is there something out there that is keeping you awake at night as you start wondering if it's getting the attention it deserves?
Sure. Well, you can almost guarantee we'll be surprised. Surprise is endemic to international relations. And I think, that will certainly continue. One of the characteristics of great power, superpower competitions like the old Cold War and like this new Cold War is that while you have a clear sense of who your main strategic rival is and maybe some sense of what it takes to beat them over the long haul, because it's a global contest of systems across the board, of national power across the board, and because of the deterrent effect of nuclear weapons that may limit large-scale war or make it very risky, that conflict becomes indirect through a lot of other means, influence and others. And that means that surprise, comes up. If you look at the history of the Cold War, we didn't expect to be involved here, there, or somewhere else. And that's just a feature, I think, of that kind of system. And then there are things where if you take your eye off the ball, you can get surprised. And there I worry about a resurgence of global jihadi terrorism. We have them down right now. We can keep them down if we apply the lessons that we've learned over the past couple decades. But if we take our eye off the ball and stop the persistent intelligence against them and the ability to strike them or capture them when necessary, we may find ourselves with another 9/11 situation, which we certainly don't want.
No, we certainly don't. Here's from one of our special operators. I think a question will go right to the heart of your experience, Mike. He talks about Soft Week 2023 introduced a heavy focus on the future of the hyper-enabled operator, assessing, selecting, and developing operators across a myriad of interconnected domains. What skills and attributes do you see as vital for the operator, Special Operations Force's success in the following years?
Well, I think we need different kinds of operators. So yes, some will be even more enabled than they are today through technology, particularly with autonomous systems and with very powerful information tools like artificial intelligence. But that will affect our kinetic operators, at least in the latter case of artificial intelligence, as well as our non-kinetic operators. You know, that non-kinetic environment of influence operations is changing rapidly and growing by leaps and bounds as well. So I think you'll need multiple kinds of operators going forward. And you know, in some cases we can substitute technology, unmanned systems for humans. In other cases we can't. And you know, we enable the human with more technology. And so knowing the difference is very important there, I think, for defense planning. But there's also the part that I think doesn't change, and that is relationships. That's important in intelligence relationships. It's important, you know, as you know, in high command coalition relationships. It's important in special operators. And if we're going to win the global influence competition against China and Russia, a lot of it is going to be because of human to human relationships and engagement, as much as it is, you know, whiz bang hyper operators, because, you know, direct combat with a great power may be deterred, as it was during the Cold War. It may be limited, but the normal competition is going to be this competition for influence, and that's going to require more of these relationship skills than necessarily the super high tech operator. So my answer, I guess, my long-winded answer is all of the above. It's not one thing; it's lots of different things that we'll need.
Yeah, and they have more areas they have to master, I think, in order to be an effective operator, since the integration of those other aspects will be key. You leave one uncovered, and that could be where the enemy's got a surprise waiting for you, and none of them ambushes.
And one can't necessarily master them all, but it is important for our senior leaders to be able to integrate those different effects. I agree totally.
Yeah, we've got a question here that goes to our domestic situation. And you and I spent a lot of time focused on external enemies. And I think for all of us right now, there's a worry about where we're going internally. We seem to be losing some of our traditional ability to work together across the aisle. There's a lack of friendliness, frankly, maybe even respect. And the question that comes in from Andre is, he says, when you have a extraordinary polarization in our society, where a sizable segment of Americans believe DOJ or FBI are traitors, how do we begin to change the dynamic? And I would broaden it to say, how do we restore trust between the elements of the government that are now being portrayed in an unfavorable light? How do we convince our fellow citizens, he asks, that Department of Justice, FBI, CIA, and the military are here to serve them? You've been in the uniform part, you've been in the civilian policy, presidential appointee area. You're an educator just by your nature, having been one of your students, I'm proud to say, in my case. How would you look at something where we made assumptions that, of course, we're the good guys? We're not the military, we're the US military. How do we get back to that? I know the museum that we're talking about putting up is one part, so people actually come in and touch and feel the SOF and the intel community. But any thoughts on this to answer his question?
Yeah, so I mean, it is the thing that I worry most about in crafting an effective grand strategy for this new Cold War. You know, so if you draw an analogy between 1946 and 1947, and you're trying to figure out how are we going to compete and then eventually win this competition with these strategic rivals or adversaries. To me, the most important element in this clash of systems is restoring our domestic health. And that is our national will to the American way of life, but also a degree of our national unity and our resilience. And one of the things that gives me a bit of confidence is if you look at the Cold War, you know, we had cycles where we convulsed, in the 1950s with the McCarthy hearings and stuff, and then realized how bad that was and got ourselves out of it. And then in the 1970s, a bit coming out of Vietnam, where our institutions were discredited, intelligence community, we had scandals, we had, our warriors spit upon coming back from war. We recovered from that within, half a decade or so. And it takes political leadership. It takes non-governmental people recognizing some of the errors, and the culture wars ought to cut both ways rather than this stuff we battle about now. It really ought to be about how to build a healthy culture, and we all share a role in that. But so I'm hoping we see that. I'm hoping it doesn't take a disastrous event to shake us out of our stupor. As you said, you and I have spent our lives on the foreign side of things, and we've taken many oaths to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. The domestic part took new emphasis for me after January 6, 2021. And it's not that we should see our fellow Americans as enemies, but we do have some that are threats to the system. And, we've dealt with that before, and I think we can deal with it again, but we need the will to do it.
Yeah, it's interesting that the two of us have spent probably 8 decades in this fight against external enemies. I share your concern, your worry most about what's going on internally right now to us. We're all, after all, custodians of our republic, and we need everyone to roll up their sleeves and figure a way to help out here. We have a question coming in from Colonel Ted Saline, Army retired. Will Russia counterattack, or just basically wait the world out and just keep things going there? This gets into the level of mystery, I think, not just intelligence, but it's an interesting issue to look at. And how should we look at that question? Over to you for your thoughts, Mike.
Yeah, so what they're doing right now are these, terrorizing civilians with these, the strategic air campaign they have with Iranian drones and Russian missiles and stuff that are regularly inflicting casualties on Ukrainian cities. And they've built defenses in depth, much, standard Russian doctrine with, lines of defense and heavily mined and covered by artillery fire. I don't think they have a lot of mobile strategic reserve capability that they can throw into the fight right now. They're really trying to take tanks out of, ancient ones out of mothballs in Russia to bring them into the fight. And so I think they're more in a defensive posture right now. And so the big question is, I think, will the Ukrainians be able to break through those lines in depth on multiple axes to really paralyze the Russian army? Or, in other words, will it look like combat sort of pre the late 1918 offensives when the Allies finally broke through and were able to sustain it? Or will they look like, you gain 20 miles and then you get bogged down by the next line of defense? And so that seems to me to be more where we're headed right now.
Yeah, we only have a few minutes left here. We have a question from Robert. Why are we still wary of Putin's red lines, especially since it seems that he does not or cannot respond when we cross them? And here, let me throw something out to you, Mike. Bill Burns, probably nobody, the director of CIA, knows Putin better in America. And when he takes Putin's threats about nuclear weapons seriously, I stop and listen. But let me throw that over to you, Mike. I know the closer you are to the apex of government and the responsibility to keep the country safe, the more cautious you are about disregarding an enemy capability that he has. But how do you answer Robert when he basically is questioning that Putin's red lines are really just bluffs what are his true red lines? And how do we determine something like this? Is a creature straight out of Dostoevsky.
Yeah.
If you study Russian literature, you'll see Putin show up repeatedly in there. But over to you, Mike. It's an interesting question.
Yeah, so I think there has been over concern about Putin's red lines through this conflict, but that doesn't mean they don't exist at some point, as you said, under some conditions. So, Russia's ability to really expand the war and do World War III has been talked about. They don't have the capability to do that. They may have the intent to do it. They lack the capability. And you see that evidence in Ukraine. They've taken a lot of punishment and haven't responded, which suggests there's headroom perhaps to do more within that band. Russia maintained tactical nuclear weapons, or non-strategic nuclear weapons, as some people call them, after the Cold War, when we gave up almost all of ours. And the reason they did is because they felt that they had shifted from a period where they had conventional superiority, which we eventually eroded in the late Cold War, but to a position where they had clear conventional inferiority against the West. And they didn't believe, they still felt they had superiority over Ukraine. And so tactical nuclear weapons were important in their doctrine to defend Russia, and were just another weapon. So would he use battlefield nuclear weapons in Ukraine, either against the population center or against Ukrainian formations if Russian forces were getting routed? He might, but it's not the same as defending Russian territory, even though he's annexed it. You'd presume that the red lines would get more actionable upon the more Russia itself was threatened, rather than just a defeat, because consequences will come with the use of those weapons. And so, his best benefit so far, strategic benefit, has been to threaten the use of these weapons rather than actually use them. Unless you have a concentration of forces on the battlefield, or unless you hit a city with them, the effect is not going to be as huge as one might think. And so
exactly. We're going to have to leave it there. We've got dozens more questions, and they're really good ones. I wish we had another hour here. We could easily fill it. But when you retired in 2015, Mike, you got the Presidential National Security Medal from President Obama, richly deserved from all of us who'd watched you in action. And President Obama said you always show up at precisely the right place at the right time. Sounds a bit like Forrest Gump to me, frankly. But as you look back, what are you most proud of in your truly illustrious career and service to all of us and our nation? What lessons would you leave with us? What are you proudest of?
Well, I think between Afghanistan in the 1980s and then our campaigns against Al-Qaeda, and then the operation that killed Osama bin Laden, I felt that I had contributed operationally, in the first case as an operator, in the latter two cases more as a policymaker, to bringing an end to two eras, or a near end, in the case of Al-Qaeda, that I had lived in. And so I feel a sense of accomplishment there. I have a section in the book, though, that success is never final. And, the thing that I'm most cognizant of these days is the need to pass on lessons to the next generation, so they can keep us safe decades into the future.
Well, thanks, Mike. If they read the book, I guarantee you they'll be better armed for the next fight. Back over to you, Charlie.
Thank
Thank
you
you both. I know I speak on behalf of all the hundreds of people watching tonight to say what a really fabulous discussion this was, hearing the two of you talk. And what it reinforced for me is just how important it is to have people of your caliber guiding U.S. national security, number one. And also, General Mattis, what you said a few minutes ago, I don't think can be overstated enough, which is that our external strength depends entirely on our internal strength as a nation. And that's so important. So I just want to thank this opportunity to thank you both for your time, for your selfless service to our nation, for your support for the OSS Society and this charity's vital work. And I know we have many people tonight watching who serve in the intelligence and Special Operations community. I want to thank them for their service and also thank them for the terrific questions. We could easily have spent another hour, and I'm sure everybody would have loved to. So hopefully we can follow this up again with another discussion between the two of you. And now I'd like to share with you the OSS Society's most ambitious project. An OSS staffer said General Donovan's imagination was so powerful, he could see an acorn and envision an oak tree. And the OSS Society is planning to tell the story of how OSS became the modern-day intelligence and special operations communities by building the National Museum of Intelligence and Special Operations. The overhead rendering you see on your screen is what you're going to see flying into Dulles International Airport when the museum is built. It will honor Americans who've served at the tip of the spear as our nation's first line of defense since World War II, and we hope it will inspire future generations to serve as well. And if you'd like to get involved, you can scan the QR code on the screen or send an email to the address that we've just posted to the chat function. Eventually, educational programs such as today's will be held in the museum's OSO Social Club, which will serve as a gathering place for today's descendants of OSS founder General Wild Bill Donovan's glorious amateurs, because as a special operator once told me, every operation starts or ends in a bar. And now we'd like to show you a brief video that captures the vision of the museum, and we welcome your support in making this vision a reality.
Today's Special Operations Forces and intelligence community were born out of the glorious amateurs of World War II's OSS, Office of Strategic Services. They are the first in the fight at the tip of the spear. They defend the freedoms we take for granted, yet their stories of bravery, dedication, and sacrifice are rarely told.
I used to look at the pictures of people in the OSS, our history. I always used to look at the faces and I looked at the eyes, and what dawned on me was there's no difference between those people that were doing that as the greatest generation and the people that are doing it now.
The National Museum of Intelligence and Special Operations will be a sacred space, honoring America's quiet professionals, our clandestine officers and special operators who live in the shadows and volunteer to go into harm's way and fight behind enemy lines. Innovative exhibits and immersive storytelling will depict the harrowing exploits of these courageous men and women, bringing to life many of America's greatest untold stories.
There's the same commitment, there's the same belief in country, there's the same love of what this nation stands for. And there are people that are ready to pay the rent and, basically look at somebody and say, you need somebody to go? Send me. I'm your person.
Visitors will have a front row seat as history unfolds around them. They will encounter the challenges that our special operators and intelligence officers face, testing their mettle to see if they have what it takes to answer our country's call to serve. The museum will be built in Northern Virginia, in the heart of the U.S. intelligence community, just outside our nation's capital. Its award-winning spearhead design, which embodies the spirit of the OSS and its successor organizations, will be visible from the flight path for Dulles International Airport. The museum will serve as the community's heart and soul, with outdoor spaces, an educational center, an executive boardroom, and dramatic locations for private events. The OSO Social Club, inspired by the Ritz Hotel's Bar Hemingway in Paris, will serve as a gathering place for today's descendants of OSS founder General Wild Bill Donovan's glorious amateurs. A memorial to the fallen will remind visitors that freedom has a cost. The ultimate sacrifice paid by special operators and intelligence personnel who laid down their lives, often anonymously, for their loved ones, their fellow fighters, and for the nation they loved.
These silent warriors of the intelligence and special operations communities do their job out of public view. Their actions are vital to protecting our national security. The National Museum of Intelligence and Special Operations will tell their story of sacrifice, dedication, and bravery. I ask you to join me in supporting this important effort. America needs this museum.
Join us at the tip of the spear.
Again, I'd like to thank General Mattis and Dr. Vickers for sharing their time with us and for such an enlightening discussion. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, BCG Federal, Incatel, FedEx, General Atomics, and our series patrons listed on your screen for their generous support of our planned museum and for the Oh So Social Conversation series. To learn more about the OSS Society, please visit our website, osssociety.org, or scan the QR code on the screen for a membership application. When you join, you'll receive a OSS Society membership card, and it's a replica of General Donovan's OSS ID card, as you can see on your screen. I want to thank you again for your support and your service and the generous commitment of your time tonight. As we close this evening, I'm honored to share with you tonight the OSS Society's award-winning short documentary, Operation Overlord, OSS and the Battle for France. This film tells the story of Allied Special Forces whose daring exploits changed the course of World War II. It was most recently shown at the OSS Society's D-Day commemoration on Capitol Hill, which was held a week ago, where we honored many of the Allied nations that fought together on D-Day with a replica of the OSS Congressional Gold Medal. This film is an important and timely reminder that as America and its allies confront totalitarianism on the European continent once again, we must have the same courage to defend democracy and to fight tyranny as the American and Allied soldiers who stormed the beaches of Normandy. General Donovan would expect nothing less from us. Thank you again. I hope you all have a good night, and I hope you enjoy our film. Thank you.
On this anniversary of D-Day, I'm honored to introduce the film Operation Overlord, OSS and the Battle for France. This powerful film tells the story of Allied Special Forces, whose daring exploits changed the course of World War II and helped save the world from tyranny. Their courage and sacrifice deserve our eternal gratitude. Having had the privilege of serving as Secretary of Defense and Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, I know the men and women who serve today in the intelligence and special operations communities. They are our nation's first line of defense, and they've been inspired by the proud legacy presented in this film. I'm honored to support the OSS Society's efforts to build the National Museum of Intelligence and Special Operations in order to tell their story. The museum will honor Americans who have served at the tip of the spear since World War II. The spearhead points the way forward in the past, the present, and the future. I hope you'll enjoy this film.
June 5th, 1944, dawned raw and cold over the English Channel. Due to the foul weather, D-Day, the greatest invasion in the history of the world, was put off for another day. More than 150,000 American, British, Canadian, and Allied troops waited throughout England. Hitler still held sway over most of Europe. France, Belgium, the Low Countries, and Scandinavia remained under hostile Nazi occupation. More than 50,000 Nazi troops and multiple Panzer tank divisions awaited the invasion. The Germans had meticulously prepared the Normandy beaches for an Allied slaughter. But the Allies had been preparing for this day for a long time. Members of the French resistance, nicknamed the Maquis, were poised throughout France to rise up in revolt. They had been courageously harassing the Nazi occupiers for more than a year, and now awaited the Allied landing at Normandy to support their mass uprising. To assist the Maquis, the British Special Operations Executive, or SOE, and OSS recruited, trained, and equipped French-speaking commandos to fight a shadow war against the Nazis. They included Jedburghs, SOE and Special Air Services teams, larger OSS operational groups, and members of the Free French Forces, commanded by General Charles de Gaulle. The Jedburghs were composed of teams of 2 Allied officers and a wireless radio operator, a combination of French, British, and American soldiers. More than 80 Jedburgh teams, equipped with light arms and wireless radios, were parachuted in to help organize, arm, train, and lead tens of thousands of French resistance fighters against the Nazis. In the 6 months before the invasion, the Maquis, along with OSS commandos, sabotaged more than 100 factories and destroyed more than 1,000 locomotives, helping bring heavy industry to a halt. The OSS Field Photographic Branch, commanded by Hollywood director John Ford, photographed the coastline from low-flying B-25s. The OSS Research and Analysis Branch prepared topographic studies of the Normandy coast for the Army and Navy and analyzed German targets in France for the 8th Air Force. The Carpetbaggers, the air arm of the OSS, and the Royal Air Force delivered more than 10,000 tons of supplies to the French resistance, including light weapons, ammunition, explosive devices, wireless radio sets and crystals, medicines, shoes, clothing, and hard cash. To gather intelligence for D-Day, General Eisenhower initiated Sussex, a joint British-French-American operation. More than 100 French volunteers parachuted into France. Captain René Veuve of the Free French Forces jumped into Chartres. His OSS codename was Joyeuse, joyful. René transmitted information about enemy infrastructure, such as Paris's La Bourget Airport, an oil refinery, and an underground V-1 rocket factory. Operating independently, OSS landed veteran agent Virginia Hall from a British motor torpedo boat into Brittany. Equipped with a forged ID, she eluded the Gestapo, mapped drop zones, set up safe houses, and helped to arm and train 3 battalions of Maquis. OSS Commander Wild Bill Donovan said, "As long as we had the Sussex teams ahead of us, it was like we had a brightly lit path, but beyond it was like advancing into a dark tunnel." In the words of Winston Churchill, these pre-invasion teams of Allied irregulars and exiled French resistance fighters were encouraged to set Europe ablaze. In the darkness before dawn on June 6, 1944, the invasion finally commenced. thousands of ships and landing craft crossing the channel in the largest amphibious assault in military history. Their targets were 5 beaches, stretching out for 50 miles along the coast of Normandy: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. Facing these Allied soldiers and sailors was the Atlantic Wall, a long line of concrete bunkers, pillboxes, land mines, and steel obstacles constructed by the Nazis to keep the Allies out, to create a kill zone on the exposed beaches and drive the Allies back out to sea.
Almighty God, our sons, pride of our nation, this day have set upon a mighty endeavor, a struggle to preserve our republic, our religion, and our civilization, and to set free a suffering humanity. Lead them straight and true. Give strength to their arms, stoutness to their hearts, steadfastness in their faith. They will need thy blessings. Their road will be long and hard. For the enemy is strong. He may hurl back our forces. Success may not come with rushing speed, but we shall return again and again. And we know that by thy grace and by the righteousness of our cause, our sons will triumph.
Charles Hostler's OSS counterintelligence unit landed on Utah Beach and quickly took control of a network of enemy agents and French civilians. They sent misinformation to the Germans that convinced Hitler that Normandy was just a feint. A bigger invasion would soon land elsewhere. Through the Allies' efforts, whole divisions of Germany's military might were delayed or diverted. The 2nd SS Das Reich Panzer Division was bottled up for 3 weeks by Free French forces and Jedburgh teams ammonia and quinine, allowing time for the armored divisions of General Patton's Third Army to strike headlong across France toward Germany. U.S. Captain Paul Cyr and 2 French officers of Jedburgh Team George parachuted into Brittany to assist an SAS commando team. The Jeds filed this initial report. 4,000 partisans must receive 100 Brens, 1,000 Stens, 1,000 battle dress. Situation hot. Will explode if arms not received. Team George succeeded in passing along German fortification plans for the Brittany coast. Sergeant Robert Kehoe, codenamed Passata, was the radio operator for Jedburgh Team Frederick, who jumped into Brittany. One of his first transmissions said, SAS attacked Monday and dispersed, guarding 3 of their wounded. Jeds, okay. Paris-Brest underground radio, cut. London replied, congratulations, Passata, on your promotion to First Sergeant. U.S. Lieutenant Robert Anstedt, a member of Jedburgh Team Hamish, jumped into Indre in central France. After organizing the local maquis, Team Hamish radioed HQ London. Railroad and telephone finished. Roads difficult. Impossible to stop Boche, but can slow down by ambush. For this, need mines and booby traps. Been playing games with Boche patrols. It's fun. U.S. Captain Bernie Knox, a member of Jedburgh Team Giles, was warned at his pre-invasion briefing to act like a gentleman and behave himself as a good guest of France once they parachuted into Brittany. Apparently, this warning fell on deaf ears. As Bernie later said about the American Jeds, I have never known such a bunch of troublemakers in my life. U.S. Major John Gildy parachuted with Jedburgh Team Ian into Vienna. They sabotaged the Paris-Bordeaux Railroad, trained thousands of maquis, and created a heavily defended bastion that was like a fortified city. But their luck ran out when their French radio operator Sergeant Bourgogn's car was attacked by Nazis, and he and his driver were killed. Captain Defarge remarked, "I never saw Gildy show any emotion, but when the sergeant was killed, I thought he'd never stop crying." U.S. Major Bill Colby parachuted into Lyon as a member of Jedburgh Team Bruce. Colby was nearly betrayed to the Gestapo, as his local resistance leader was Roger Bardet, a French traitor. Colby went on to lead Bruce on missions with the Maquis to shore up General Patton's vulnerable right flank as his tanks roared hell-bent for leather across France toward Paris. General Donovan said, "The battle for France showed as never before the extent of the assistance that an oppressed people, given supplies and leadership, can render its allies in the course of its liberation." General Eisenhower said, "In no previous war have resistance forces been so closely harnessed to the main military effort. The organized forces of resistance played a very considerable part in our final and complete victory."
With thy blessing, we shall prevail over the unholy forces of our enemy. Help us to conquer the apostles of greed and racial arrogances. Lead us to the saving of our country, and with our sister nations into a world unity that will spell a sure peace. A peace invulnerable to the schemings of unworthy men, and a peace that will let all men live in freedom, reaping the just rewards of their honest toil.